And again, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Joelle Marier. I am the Executive Director of the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really glad to have you all here. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. There will be time for questions after Michelle's presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please pop them into the chat and we will do our best to address all of your questions as time allows at the end of the hour. If there is really lively discussion, I've got an extra 15 minutes reserved after the top of the hour to accommodate any extra time needed. Out of respect for our presenter and other participants, please make sure to mute your microphone throughout the webinar. And we'll have time at the end for folks to ask questions, raise their hand, and you can unmute yourself if you are called on to share your question. So with this, let's get started. Today, I am happy to welcome Michelle Reilly of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Michelle is the National Wildlife Refuge System Wilderness Liaison at the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center, and she serves as a wildlife biologist and course leader at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Conservation Training Center. Michelle has done extensive work piecing together the history of the Wilderness Act through historical documents, and she's here today to walk us through her findings and shed more light on the story of this legislation that guides so much of our work today. So with that, I just want to say a big welcome to you, Michelle, and I will turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second to share my presentation. Okay. Joelle, is that showing up on your end?
It is, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. And this webinar, I'm going to present some research that I've done with some historical documents to help provide context to the drafting of the wilderness bills, as well as the Wilderness Act itself. And I'll incorporate some past research from various publications on the topic. I encourage you to listen and to make your own choices. I'm going to advocate for a forward-looking interpretation of wilderness and an interpretation that helps us move forward in a positive way. So we all know that the Wilderness Act was signed into law by President Johnson on September 3rd, 1964. But the Wilderness Act wasn't without struggle. It required many hearings and redrafting and compromises, and that's common. That's how laws get made. There are diverse groups with diverse interests, and redrafting is part of the process. This is a document dated April 4th, 1936, and it's a note from the first meeting of the Washington section of the Wilderness Society, and it has a list of names of all those members who are in attendance. And of the 17 shown in the attendee list, 9 are women. And I just want you to keep this in your thoughts, keep this in your mind, because it is insight to the history of the wilderness movement, and it'll be brought back up later in this presentation. This is the definition of wilderness from the Wilderness Act. Some of the words and phrases are bolded, and that's because of some of the ongoing criticism about these phrases. Again, I invite you to look at this within the historical context and with the accompanying historical documentation that I'm going to show you and help develop a forward-looking interpretation. I'm not sure if you've seen this quote before. It was supposedly said by an agency man during the Nixon trials. It can also be traced to an earlier ad campaign about some marketing research, but really the history of the saying isn't important. I put it up as a reminder to be open-minded, to not be like the agency man. There may be some historical documents or historical material presented that makes you uncomfortable. My intention is not to make anyone uncomfortable or to blame or shame any group or agency. My hope is to present the material in an open and honest way so that we can all gain some understanding of the history. And so with that, let's dive in with an open mind and historical looking glass. So, the idea of wilderness has been the subject of ongoing academic and popular debate. There's been criticism for decades about the act being dualistic, ethnocentric, and static. One critic states that the definition of wilderness offered in the Wilderness Act, quote, assumes, indeed, it enshrines a bifurcation of man and nature. So these three topics listed on the slide are the subjects that I'm going to present in this presentation today. And this ongoing conversation has really helped advocates, philosophers, and historians alike to think more clearly about the historical and contemporary meaning of wilderness. And it's worth noting that the thoughts and beliefs attributed to the criticisms of the idea of wilderness do not seem to be reflected in the intentions of the Wilderness Act authors, subsequent congressional actions, or federal management practices. So I'll mention again that the debate surfaces or has surfaced numerous times over the years, and I believe that the reason it doesn't gain traction is that, as I'll show you over the next few slides, a lot of the critiques can be minimized by the facts found through historical documentation. Before getting into those critiques, I'm just going to start off with acknowledging another point of contention that comes up. The Wilderness Act uses this language. In particular, there are parts in the act that use the word man, and some critics have suggested or stated that this language is exclusive and that it perpetuates gender bias. So the question really is, do these statements in the Wilderness Act mean that the framers intended to limit wilderness for the male population, or that such a framing is one possible alternative? So, taking words and phrases out of context isn't helpful in understanding the meaning of any acts, not just the Wilderness Act. This is a Supreme Court case. It's not about wilderness, but it does help with the interpretation of law. So, the court found that, quote, it is of course true that statutory construction is a holistic endeavor, and that the meaning of a provision is clarified by the remainder of the statutory scheme. So what does that mean? Essentially, they're stating that the meaning of a phrase in an act is clarified by the use of similar terminology and by the context of other language in the law. So let's look at the rest of the statutory scheme. What else does the act say? So here you can see that it's the complete title of the act says the permanent good of the whole people. Um, In Section 2A, you see it's the policy of Congress to secure for the American people. And then again in 2A, shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people. So sometimes they might use the word man, but other times they use phrases like this, American people, whole people. Okay, so we saw what the act looks like and use of the word. But how was the word used historically? And more importantly, how was it being used in the 50s when the act was being written or the bills were being written? So first, I want to point out again that the document should be read with a historical lens. Could you get offended that it says man instead of human? You could, yes, but let's look at the historical context and the supporting evidence. So this just shows that the word man, similar to mankind, was really a gender neutral word, and it was used generically for human race. Okay, so I put this up. There's an important quote by Howard Zonnheiser in a publication called The Living Wilderness, and he was quoted by Miss Ellen Brooker of Seattle during the 1957 hearing before the U.S. Senate Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs. And she quotes him and states, "It's not for the sake of any privileged few that we are thus working so strenuously for wilderness preservation, but rather all Americans." So, again, others that weren't involved with drafting the wilderness bills also believed that wilderness was for all people. And the quote by Howard actually continues, and further down in the article, he states, "There is no person that we should like to exclude." So again, thinking back to that attendance record that I showed at the first at the beginning of the presentation, that 1937 Wilderness Society meeting, and over half the people in attendance were women, and this testimony and the language that's used, I hope that we see that the use of the word man um, was not meant to be exclusive, and it was just used generically. This is a famous or maybe semi-famous memo written in 1919 by Arthur Carhart to Aldo Leopold. Both were Forest Service employees at the time. And as envisioned by Carhart and Leopold and Bob Marshall, wilderness in the United States was devoted to several key principles, one being that these areas should provide public access to federal lands for people of a variety of means, stripping away the privilege of class, land ownership, and motorized transportation. So, beginning in 1915, the Term Permit Act allowed the Forest Service to grant 30-year leases for recreational development, such as lodges, forest camps, summer homes. And Carhart feared that public access would be strangled by the term permit developments, rimming the lakeshore of Trappers Lake. And Carhart considered this an inappropriate exclusion of simple public access in favor of a privileged few. So here you can see that Carhart was opposed to the privatization of all areas. He believed that these scenic areas were the right of all people and not just the privileged few. And again, this is just more evidence to support the discussions we're going to have. There are more quotes in the same letter. Carhart writes that the beauties of which a right should be the property of all people. And then again, further down says, rightfully always the property of the entire public. So this is a quote by Leopold, and Leopold was no doubt influenced by privileged conservationists such as Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, but many of his writings suggested or indicated that he had a very different idea of social priorities and notions of class. And Leopold's wilderness vision viewed roads and automobiles as particularly disruptive, both socially and economically. Um, but also, he expressed concern that the increasing trend toward outdoor experiences being available only for the elite few. So, what he is quoted here saying is, but the expense of such trips puts them out of the question for the citizen of moderate means, and he is the man I'm talking about. I'm trying to make it clear that a wilderness hunting trip is by way of becoming a rich man's privilege, whereas it has always been a poor man's right. So again, the idea of wilderness wasn't about limiting access for certain user or certain men or demographics, but it was a response to what was happening in our culture at this point in time. Here's Miss Ellen Brooker again. I'm gonna use her testimony again because she speaks to this criticism directly. And she states, whoever started that silly phrase that the wilderness is only for the hardy few hasn't been out in our mountains in the last few years. Um, so again, wilderness really was meant for all people of all abilities. So this phrase that's underlined in this slide gets a lot of criticism. It might suggest that man is separate from nature, that there is a dichotomy between humans and nature. But I don't believe that the authors of the act were suggesting that. So let's look at earlier drafts of the bill. I love looking at historical documents and reading drafts of the Wilderness Act. And here's a screenshot from a 1957 draft of the Wilderness Bill. So the criticism we're examining right now is that wilderness excludes humans, that it's a targeted place where man is just visiting, and that the word untrammeled eclipses human presence. But read what was written in an earlier draft of the Wilderness Act, in a draft of the bill. It says that it's hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a member of the natural community, a wanderer who visits but does not remain, and whose travels leave only trails, not trials. I think that was a typo, but we'll just excuse that for now. I think it's fantastic. I mean, man isn't separate from nature. He's part of the natural community. And I think it's a very powerful view that sheds a lot of light on the intentions in this section of the definition. But what else can we find about the intentions of those who were involved with drafting the wilderness bills and the wilderness idea itself? What did others think? Um, Next, I'm going to show you two quotes from Sigurd Olson, who was very influential in protecting the boundary waters and also helped draft the Wilderness Act. And this is a publication called The Wilderness Concept, and it was written in 1956. And in this publication, Olson quotes G.M. Traveling, who is a British author, historian, and academic, and he said, "We are literally children of the earth, and removed from her, our spirit withers and runs to various forms of insanity." And then Olson goes on to state, because wilderness means different things to people, when the final summary of values is made, the answer will no doubt be a combination of them all. So both of these quotes suggest that man is very much a part of nature. And further, it suggests that wilderness was open to all people, and those drafting the bills already considered that a combination of the values from different people was what was going to make wilderness so important. So we have to remember that there were 66 drafts of the bill. There were hundreds of people providing input and suggesting edits, negotiating compromises, and shortening text. So the history is important. And what we have in the bill isn't wrong, but it is a product of the times and of the bill writing process. Look how slight the difference is. Between the act and then earlier drafts. Um, it's such a slight difference, but it's so impactful. The intention seems completely different. This is a screenshot again from a 1957 hearing in regards to the wilderness bill. And this is actually Howard Zonheiser, and he was testifying. And let me just read the highlighted section. He states, "It is also a characteristic of wilderness to impress its visitors with their relationship to other forms of life, and to afford those who linger an intimation of the interdependence of all life." And then it continues down below, as to impress its visitors with their relationship to other forms of life. So for me, reading this earlier draft that said that man was a part of the natural community, along with this testimony that states twice the importance of the relationship between man and nature and the interdependence of all life, I cannot read this and think that the intentions of the authors were to set man apart or above nature. To me, it doesn't leave me with any suggestion that humans were in wilderness to conquer and control nature through challenge. And I don't see a dichotomy. I don't see a man versus nature intention in these writings. But the intentions aren't known. We can only research and interpret the paper trail, the interviews, and the recordings that were left behind. I'd say that there is substantial evidence that the intentions were not, that there was not a dichotomy between man and nature. Okay, so um, let's review the word untrammeled. There's been criticism that untrammeled wilderness refers only to pristine nature. Critics have read the word untrammeled and conflated it with pristine and pure, two words never used in the act. And so, why does this interpretation keep coming up time and time again? How did it get started? Let's look at the history. So prior to the statutory regulations that were written into the Wilderness Act, the Forest Service generally allowed some form of development like logging, grazing, and its own road building within the boundaries of their wilderness areas. So the proposed definition of wilderness and the wilderness bills was much stricter and not overly well received, initially at least, by industries or the USDA. So again, it's important to note that it was the parties opposed to expanding the wilderness system and not wilderness advocates who really embraced this dualism inherent in the purity definition. So the timber industries and others invoked this notion of pristine wilderness to prevent commercially valuable lands from being included in the National Wilderness Preservation System. And the Forest Service argued that, according to the Wilderness Act, lands previously impacted by humans in any way could no longer be considered as candidates for wilderness designation. And defining wilderness in this way became known as the purity definition of wilderness. So in the early 1970s, the roadless area review and evaluation process, in which the Forest Service used this strict purity definition or interpretation of wilderness. So they used that for inventorying their potential wilderness areas. And the findings were rejected by public, by Congress, and by the Carter administration. And the Forest Service had to redo that entire process using the non-purity interpretation, the definition of wilderness as stated in Section 2C of the Wilderness Act. And uh, it resulted in inclusion of many areas as potential wilderness. So you can see in the slide, and the first iteration of this evaluation process, only 274 wilderness study areas containing about 12.3 million acres were included. That was rejected. They were told to go back, don't use this purity interpretation of the definition. And when they redid it, almost 3,000 areas containing 62 million acres. So a substantial difference, substantial. And another example of Congress and the public rejecting this purity interpretation or purity definition of untrammeled wilderness can be seen in the Eastern Wilderness Areas Act, which passed in 1975. Eastern areas were much smaller. They showed signs of significant human impact. But this law did pass, and this is Congress demonstrating that untrammeled wilderness did not mean unused, untouched, or unaltered by human hands. Bob Marshall, probably known by everyone, was a socialist and persistent advocate for social justice. Um, Bob Marshall defined wilderness in the early days before the Wilderness Act, and he specifically recognized that, quote, trails and temporary shelters, which were common long before the advent of the white race, are entirely permissible. So again, the authors of the act and early wilderness advocates, they were not interested in this idea of pristine wilderness. They were interested in protection against modern environmental threats and the privatization of lands. Pure and pristine are not words used in the act, and I caution those who attempt to interpret the intentions of the authors in that way. It wasn't just the authors who didn't intend wilderness to be unused. It has been exemplified in some subsequent wilderness designations by the public and by wilderness managers. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the last criticism. Um, this one will take a little bit longer, but we're doing great on time. So, critics of the wilderness idea emphasize that our understanding of wilderness is uniquely a European American cultural artifact, that the myth of America as pristine wilderness prior to European settlement renders the original inhabitants of the continent invisible, and it conveniently whitewashes the tragic history of their persecution at the hands of European American settlers. And the fact that the continent was already inhabited by millions of Native Americans presented a serious problem to both the myth of manifest destiny and the myth of pristine wilderness. And the results have been the same for Native people: dispossession, dislocation, and suffering. It's a lot. So let's just pause for a moment and separate this out and look at our timeline and get our facts straight. So let's look more closely, colonialism and wilderness. So critiques of wilderness may include quotes from the early 1800s that state the frontier was uninhabited wilderness. And that should give you pause in this argument. Obviously, the notion of wilderness in the 1800s is not the same as designated wilderness today. The history of the lands that became Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Glacier National Parks involved negative and consequential actions on the indigenous people, undoubtedly. But the tendency to lump together the early establishment of national parks and the designation of wilderness areas makes it all too easy to overlook important historical differences between the two. The word wilderness used then and congressionally designated wilderness today that we have, it's not the same thing. And if you don't make this distinction, it adds to this confusion surrounding the wilderness debate by conflating the history of the national parks movement with the history of wilderness designation. And it's easy to just glance over this distinction, but please don't, because it implies that the understanding of wilderness that informed the establishment of some of the first national parks in the late 19th and early 20th century, with the same understanding that guided the creation of the National Wilderness Preservation System in the middle of the 20th century. The two are separate. The national parks movement did follow on the heels of the Indian Wars, but the Wilderness Act did not. Here's a few examples. So, in Montana, for example, the Confederated Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille tribes were forcibly removed from the Bitterroot Valley in the 1850s, so that land could be opened up for white farmers and ranchers. Some 100 years later, Congress created the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, um, in the mountains looming to the west of the valley. It is unfortunate that the tribes were removed off their land in the Bitterroot Valley. Incredibly and inexplicably terrible. But that happened 100 years before the area was designated as wilderness. The Tucutica Shoshone Bannocks once roamed throughout the Middle Fork of the Salmon River drainage, and they were forcibly removed in the Sheep Eater Wars in 1879 under the false pretense of murdering Chinese miners and stealing their horses. So there was thought to be gold in that area, and so um, the settlers moved in and gold was not found in abundance. And then they moved out and the area became pretty much unoccupied for decades. The middle fork of the Salmon River runs through the heart of the ancestral homelands of the Shoshone-Bannock and the Nez Perce, and it also runs through the 2.5 million acre Frank Church Wilderness, which was designated in 1980. 1980, again, almost 100 years later. Let me just offer another piece of history. In earlier drafts of the Wilderness Bill, there was originally a section that stated lands on Indian reservations could be included with the consent of the tribes. This section was taken out of the Wilderness Bills, never made it to the Wilderness Act, because the tribes did not want their lands to be included in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So that was it. It was removed from all future drafts of the bill. In 1979, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribal Council informally established a tribal wilderness and also an intern program to oversee its management. Then in 1982, the council passed Ordinance 79A, establishing the tribal wilderness, and they adopted a management plan. And so the Mission Mountain Tribal Wilderness was established by a tribal ordinance in 1982. So another point of criticism that I hear quite often is that the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act intimates a sense of purity, sort of like a cleansing of the land. People say that the word untrammeled eclipses indigenous homelands and human presence. And what I'm presenting on this slide is the definition of tribal wilderness adopted by the Confederated Salish and Kootenai. And in this definition that they adopted, you can see that they also used the phrase untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Another piece of literature, if you haven't read this article, I do recommend it. There's also a webinar that's available on the National Park Service YouTube channel with the authors, and this was written just a few years ago. And so I'm going to quote one of the authors here, and then I'll give you a little bit more context on the next slide. But one of the authors, who is Cupic, said, "It is true that early indigenous people had no conception of wilderness, but neither did Western people before they were exposed to the environmental degradations that led to the development of the wilderness ethic. We should remember that the wilderness idea evolved and continues to evolve, as do all concepts of environmental ethics, in response to new understandings and changes in society and its relationship to the environment." So this sort of brings us back to the criticism that we hear quite often when talking about wilderness, that it is a European American construct. So Polly Andrews, again, she is a Cupik tribal member and a training specialist in Alaska, and she states, oh, whoops, sorry about that. She states in this article that, it is true that there was no word for wilderness, but there weren't words for a lot of things. And again, she's saying that the tribal people adopt words and concepts as the world changes. And then she also points out that in this debate, this wilderness debate, we often focus too much on the differences. So again, a great article if you haven't read it. The third author in this article is Bernadette. She's the executive director of the Gwich'in Steering Committee and a council member for the Arctic Refuge Defense Council. And so I'm just going to read her quote here that she states in the article. She says, "We advocate for wilderness because it will provide the strongest protection for the birthing grounds of the porcupine caribou herd. More than any other modern land category or management system, wilderness recognizes our way of relating to the land and earth. The wilderness idea that humans are part of a larger community of life and should act like it has been known to my people for millennia." We live in a very diverse country. Like all groups, there are those who support wilderness and those who don't. Likewise, there are tribal groups or tribal members who support the idea of wilderness, and there are those who don't. Um, there are some tribal members who may not like the word untrammeled as used in the Wilderness Act, and there are others, like I showed the case CKST, who used the word in their definition. So we really do no justice to anyone or any group by generalizing experiences and viewpoints. We do no justice by ignoring history, and we do no justice by romanticizing other cultures. None of these things are what we would say is a growth mindset. We have to keep learning and we have to keep listening. There are a variety of viewpoints out there within all groups, and that includes indigenous groups. So, I'm just going to review a few things here and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. I wanted to wrap this up by explaining why this historical tour was important. This slide is from an article titled "Legislative Interpretation as a Guiding Tool for Wilderness Managers" by Shannon Meyer. And as we walked through this presentation, I presented the legislative history and other historical documents, and this slide suggests why that is appropriate, namely items 1 and 5 on this list. So first, in the future, I want to avoid any absurd results. And two, I want to help us as wilderness managers, users, and wilderness advocates to choose the most reasonable interpretation in what can be or is suggested to be a controversial law, the Wilderness Act. We have the tools for resolving such conflicts, and one is the legislative interpretation. So let's just do a brief review on what we've looked at. So the idea of wilderness has been the subject of ongoing popular and academic debate. There's been criticism for decades about the act being dualistic, ethnocentric, and static. Today we've looked at the criticism that wilderness perpetuates a dichotomy between humans and nature, especially the phrase untrammeled by man. I presented historical documents that helped us get closer, I hope, to the intentions of the authors, namely that humans are a part of the natural community, that wilderness is meant to impress its visitors with their relationship to other forms of life. Next, we looked at the criticism that wilderness, and especially untrammeled wilderness, suggests purity, a cleansing of the land, and eclipses um, indigenous history. And we looked at how this purity interpretation crept into wilderness when it's not a word used in the act. We saw that this influence came from anti-wilderness advocates and industries and not wilderness advocates. We saw that earlier drafters of the act did not suggest pristine wilderness, and that Congress and public support an interpretation of wilderness as being affected by man, but not dominated by man-made technologies. And then finally, we looked at the criticism that wilderness promotes a colonialist mindset, that it's a European American construct, and this is defended by stating that other cultures including Native Americans don't have a word for wilderness. I showed you the idea of little w wilderness and that it's not the same as congressionally designated wilderness, and that although the creation of some of the national parks stripped Native tribes of their homelands and ways of life, this happened hundreds of years or 100 years before wilderness designation, and that some tribes support wilderness designation now, and that generalizing is not helpful for the conversation. So that's all I have now. So we should have plenty of time for um, questions. Let me stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. That was great. I hope folks in the audience have been thinking of some good questions to ask. I haven't seen anything in the chat, although there have been a couple comments shared with links to more information or some of the references and documents that Michelle had shared. So I welcome you to check those out. Um, and yeah, I think we'll just open it up for questions now. You can either pop your questions in the chat, or if you want to ask your question out loud, just raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then you can take yourself off of mute and ask your question. And I guess I would also say comments are welcome as well. Just keep them respectful and kind. Okay, we've got a question from Kim Waits. She wonders if there's a way to access the 66 revisions of the Wilderness Act.
Um, there are a lot of drafts available through the legislative history is available as well through I think it's the Denver Library. I could be wrong about this. I'd have to look, but I can write that down and get back to Kim unless someone else in the audience has a answer for that. But they're available. Some of them are available online through different libraries. I think it's Denver, but I don't want to say that for sure because I don't remember.
Thanks. Well, while we're waiting for questions to pop up, I have one question. I hope it doesn't put you on the spot too much, but I wonder if there are current conversations happening around wilderness that have shifted the way you think about the concept of wilderness.
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. I've always had, I think, a pretty strong admiration for wilderness. I think those that drafted the wilderness bills and all the advocates that were involved, it is it was a long process and so much hard work and dedication. Um, and uh, so I think the conversation that I have become more interested in is just the seeming misunderstanding about wilderness, what it's about. And so that is really interesting to me. Um, the different ideas that people have about wilderness and how that plays out when you're in discussions about wilderness. I think that's very interesting to me. And it does um, I like listening to those people that have opposing views because it helps me think about my own view and like why I hold the view that I hold and my personal experiences. So I really do encourage people to try to listen to those people that have different views because it's always it just adds to your own personal knowledge.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. Kevin Preshold asked, does anyone know how many tribal wildernesses are in the US?
The Mission Mountain Tribal Wilderness, that was the first one, and there was a recent one not too long ago, in the Southwest. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it.
Well, I think Taos Pueblo has a de facto
Yeah,
wilderness area.
yeah, but I think that's it really that I'm aware of. Um,
Okay, a couple more questions. And if anyone knows of others that we're forgetting, feel free to pop those in the chat. But I'm with Michelle. I think there are only those two. Um, Mike is asking, will the presentation slides be available along with the recording? We certainly could do that, Mike, I think, as long as Michelle's open to that.
Yeah, that's great.
Um,
Of course.
And then in the chat, Kevin says, great presentation, thanks. In addition, critics claim where man is a visitor who does not remain erases the history of native peoples. Unfortunately, native peoples had long been removed from the 9.1 million acres of national forests that were designated in 1964. What is your reaction to this criticism?
Yeah, yeah, that's sort of what I tried to talk about in the presentation. I have read the criticisms that, where man is a visitor who does not remain, removes or let me just read this question again. Um, yeah, so the criticism to me is again, I think people just um I think there's a lot of information that can be shared about this. So I cut out a few slides because I was afraid I was going to run out of time, but um, there are other um, statements from tribal members and even the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes that they do hold, even in their own lands, and the Mission Mountain Tribal Wilderness is a great example. There are areas where they also hold that a similar belief that these areas are sacred places, and they also feel like it's a place you visit, but it's not a place that even themselves would go and occupy out of respect for that spiritual and sacred place. And so I think that's a viewpoint that has been shared with me by different tribal members and through different articles that I've read. And so that's a different perspective on the same argument. So there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen so that we can talk about these things and really see both sides and the diversity of the people involved.
Thanks, Michelle. Bob has a question. In light of these insights, what changes or clarifications, if any, would you recommend to agency policies or training related to wilderness management?
Yeah, I can't really speak to any recommendations for agency policy, but at least for us at the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center, this presentation and other similar presentations are given at almost all of our wilderness trainings, and so we really are trying to broaden the dialogue when we teach just the Wilderness Act primer at our training courses. We've changed that to really incorporate more of the social environment during the drafting of the bills, the tribal perspective, and then that's just the Wilderness Act primer, and then we also include this presentation in most of our trainings as well, again, just to get more people aware of the diversity of views and trying to broaden our perspectives a bit.
Thanks. Okay, and then we've got a question from Gary. In your opinion, has the criticism of purity you presented been too loosely interpreted in the administration of wilderness? In other words, doesn't the act require that wilderness be administered to protect it in perpetuity?
Um, I'm not sure I follow the question. I think that maybe I'll take a stab at it, and I hope, Gary, that I don't offend you by misinterpreting your question. But I think that yes, there is sometimes a mindset within the wilderness community or wilderness stewards, managers that, there is this wilderness thing, and it's like this little snow globe that they need to keep like the same in this little, this little wilderness world, and they're trying to just keep it, like that's how it was when it was designated. We have to keep it that way, but I think that perspective amongst wilderness managers is really changing. I maybe that was more so a decade ago, but the more I interact with wilderness managers, I can really see them taking these, climate change or, fire intensity and severity and just fire regime changes. They're really taking these into consideration and really thinking hard about what that means for wilderness. So I feel like maybe I'm not answering the question, and again, I apologize, but I think um, I think I've seen that mindset of like maintaining wilderness as like one static state in perpetuity has really changed, I think.
Thanks, Michelle. And Gary, feel free to, if you want to take yourself off of mute and ask your question in a different way, feel free to if you didn't get your question answered. Um, Suzanne asks, have you found any historical documentation of comments or opinions by tribal communities that were made during the drafting and debate years of the Act?
Yeah, thank you. First thank you for your compliment. The section of the wilderness bill that included Indian lands. Um, so I was given access to the Association of American Indian Affairs archive. They let me access their archive, and it gave me a lot of information about this, looking at uh, handwritten notes or typed notes between BIA and tribes and solicitors, tribal solicitors, and so there is a paper trail there that talks about that section in particular. And so there is a lot of dialogue about, and I didn't want to get into all the details, but the language first said, the language changed in that section, and it caused the tribal members to be very concerned because of the earlier roadless rule that was overlaid onto their tribal lands. And again, that was, Bob Marshall had thought of this was going to be advantageous to the tribes so that they had a roadless area to retreat from the white race and they could live their lives. But in reading through those documents, in actuality, that they didn't want that. They did want there to be roads because they wanted access and economy to grow. And so when the Wilderness Act, when that section was included in the wilderness bills, there was a lot of discussion back and forth about that and also um, the history of that roadless rule um, was in their minds as well. So it there is a lot of dialogue on that specifically, but only that one section that said Indian lands could be included in the National Wilderness Preservation System with the consent of the tribes. That's the only section that I've seen comment on from tribal communities.
Great. Um, okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Last chance if you want to ask a question is right now. Um, in the meantime, I'm going to put a couple links in the chat here. The next is advertising NWSA's December webinar, which is coming up on December 10th. You can join us to hear Lynn Westerfield from Wild Arizona talk about building relationships with the Gila Centennial Trail story map. They did a deep dive into, the Gila Centennial Trail and some of its history and ended up creating some really unexpected and positive relationships with descendants of the Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apache people. So the link is there in the chat. Um, you can access Michelle's presentation and any other webinars that NWSA has hosted here at our YouTube channel, and the link is there in the chat for you as well. If you're really just interested in our webinar series, the link for our webinar series is here, and there are descriptions and links to those events. And then finally, NWSA is really happy to be offering these webinars to our community for free. We try to have them every month, and we're reinvigorating our webinar offerings. If you're already a member of NWSA or a donor, your contributions help support this series. If you're not, I really hope you will consider becoming a member or donating to NWSA to help us keep offering this free and important content for our community. So I think that's it. If I'll be sending out a link to the recording to everyone. Since we've had a request for the slides, I'll be happy to include that with the email follow-up. And if you, I guess that's about it. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much to Michelle for this amazing presentation and doing all of this hard work that, a lot of us probably don't have the patience to do, and distilling it into stuff that's a little bit easier for us all to digest. So with that, I think we'll just close it out. And thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much.